It started like most things do, with a gut feeling I couldn't shake. Monica and I had been married for 8 years, and in that time, I had never doubted her. We had our ups and downs, sure. What marriage didn't? But lately, something had changed. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things here and there. She started working late more often. Then there were unexplained lunches, and suddenly, she was getting a lot more text messages than usual. When I asked her who it was, she'd brush it off. "Oh, just work stuff," she'd say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. I mean, I had no reason to think she was lying. We had a good life together, a house, and no kids yet, but we were trying. Things were good, or at least, I thought they were. But something about her recent behavior gnawed at me. I noticed she'd keep her phone turned upside down on the table whenever we were together. When she was out working late, I'd try to reach her, and she'd take hours to respond. Her excuses seemed rehearsed, almost too perfect. Deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, after she came home later than usual, I tried to talk to her about it. I told her I missed her, that it felt like she was drifting away. She laughed it off, telling me I was overthinking everything, that work was just getting more stressful. She even promised we'd plan a weekend getaway to reconnect. But when she kissed me goodnight, something felt hollow, like she was kissing me out of obligation rather than love. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with doubts. What if she really was cheating? What if everything I thought was true about our marriage was a lie? The idea terrified me, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know for sure. The next day, I took matters into my own hands. I had never been the kind of guy to spy on my wife. In fact, I always thought people who did that kind of thing were insecure or paranoid. But now, I understood why they did it. There's a point where your need for the truth outweighs everything else. Your pride, your trust, your morals. And I had reached that point. I did some research online and found a discreet GPS tracker that I could place on Monica's car without her ever knowing. It would let me track her every move. It was drastic, sure, but I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease. After all, maybe she really was just busy with work, and I was being irrational. This would prove once and for all that I had nothing to worry about. The tracker arrived a few days later, and I installed it late at night while Monica was asleep. My heart raced as I slid it underneath her car, securing it to the undercarriage. I felt guilty, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. If she wasn't cheating, I'd know soon enough. The next day, I logged into the tracking app on my phone, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. Monica had told me she was working a half day, and then she'd be out with some colleagues for lunch. I watched the little blue that represented her car leave the house and head toward her office, just like she said. For a few hours, everything seemed fine. I almost convinced myself that I'd been overreacting. But then, around 1 p.m., something strange happened. The dot started moving, not toward the restaurant she mentioned, but in the opposite direction, toward the outskirts of town. My heart began to pound as I watched her car take an exit off the highway, heading toward a more secluded area. A motel sat just a few miles from there. I could feel my stomach churn. No, this can't be happening. I dropped everything, grabbed my keys, and jumped into my car. I had to know where she was going, had to see it with my own eyes. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she was meeting a friend or running errands. But deep down, I knew better. When I arrived at the motel, my heart was in my throat. Her car was parked in the lot, right in front of one of the rooms. I sat there in my own car, watching, waiting, praying that I was wrong. I didn't even know what I was hoping for anymore. Did I want to catch her? Did I want to be proven right? Or did I want her to walk out of that room alone, with some kind of excuse that would make all of this go away? I didn't have to wait long. The door to the room opened, and there she was, Monica, my wife, laughing as she stepped outside. And right behind her was a man, tall, well-built, wearing a suit that looked expensive. I didn't recognize him at first, but as he stepped into the light, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. It was Matt, my best friend. My mind went blank. I sat there, unable to move, as I watched them get into his car together, oblivious to the fact that I was just a few feet away. My best friend, the man I'd known for years, trusted with everything, was sleeping with my wife. I could feel the rage building inside me, but it was mixed with something worse. Betrayal so deep it felt like I was drowning. They drove off, leaving me sitting there, stunned. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. Instead, I went home, parked the car in the driveway, and sat in silence. How could this have happened? How had I been so blind? That night, I didn't confront her. I couldn't. Instead, I waited. I tracked her every movement, watched as she made excuse after excuse, as she lied to my face about where she was and what she was doing. And every time, I felt the knife in my chest twist a little deeper. But I wasn't done yet. It wasn't enough to know. I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof of her affair. If I was going to confront her, I wanted to make sure she couldn't lie her way out of it. So I did what any desperate man would do. I hired a private investigator. The investigator worked fast, tailing Monica over the next few days, documenting everything. She wasn't even trying to hide it. They met up multiple times, each one at a different location, a hotel, a park, even once at his office. The more I saw, the angrier I got. But the worst part was the realization that this wasn't a fling. It wasn't some one-night stand. They had been carrying on this affair for months, maybe even longer. The PI delivered a folder full of photos. Monica with Matt, hand in hand, laughing, kissing. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the images in disbelief. This was my life now. This was what my marriage had become. I had everything I needed to confront her, but I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. Instead, I felt sick. What was I going to do? How was I supposed to face her now? How was I supposed to deal with the fact that my best friend, a man I had trusted more than anyone, was the one destroying my life? I stared at the photos for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. Every picture seemed worse than the last. Monica's smile, Matt's hand on the small of her back, their lips meeting in ways that should have been reserved for me. I didn't know what hurt more, the fact that she had been lying to me for months, or that it was Matt, of all people, who had betrayed me. The two people I trusted most had made me a fool. I kept imagining every conversation Matt and I had over the past few months. Each time he asked how I was doing, each time we grabbed a beer or watched a game together. He was good at pretending. He acted like my best friend, all the while sleeping with my wife behind my back. The thought of it made my stomach turn. I wanted to throw up, but even that felt like it wouldn't be enough to purge the disgust I felt inside. I didn't know how to confront them. What do you even say in a situation like this? My mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. Should I scream? Should I cry? Should I demand answers? Or would any explanation only make things worse? All I knew was that I couldn't let this continue. But part of me feared what would come next. Was I ready to face the truth head-on? I wasn't sure. The next morning, I decided that I needed more than just photos. I needed to hear it from her. Hear the lies, see if she could keep up the act, or if she would finally break under the pressure. So I waited. I tracked her every movement through the GPS tracker, my phone buzzing every time she made a move. By now, I knew her patterns, her lunch dates with Matt, her excuses about late-night work meetings that didn't exist. But I needed to catch her in the act. I needed to confront her when she was least expecting it. 2 days later, the opportunity came. Monica had texted me early in the morning, saying she had a work meeting that would run late into the evening and that I shouldn't wait up. It was the same excuse she had used a dozen times before. But this time, I knew exactly where she was going. I watched as her car left the house, following the familiar route to the hotel where she and Matt had been meeting. I called in sick to work, knowing I wouldn't be able to focus on anything but this. My heart raced the entire drive to the hotel. Every mile I covered felt like a countdown to the moment when my life would implode. I didn't know what I'd do when I got there, but I knew I had to see it with my own eyes. I had to hear the lies in person, catch her red-handed, so she couldn't deny it any longer. When I arrived at the hotel, I parked far enough away that she wouldn't see me if she looked out the window. I waited in my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind swirling with anger, betrayal, and the painful realization that my marriage was about to come crashing down. Her car was parked outside the hotel, right where the GPS had shown it. I didn't need to check the tracker anymore. I knew exactly what she was doing. But knowing and seeing were two very different things. I sat there for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was probably only about 20 minutes. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to just storm in, to confront her right there in the hotel lobby. But I didn't. I wanted to wait until I was sure they were together, so there would be no way for her to wiggle out of it. Finally, I saw them. Monica and Matt emerged from the hotel, laughing, her hand casually resting on his arm. She looked so carefree, like nothing in the world was wrong, like she hadn't been lying to me for months, like she hadn't betrayed me in the worst possible way. I could barely see straight. The rage that boiled inside me made it hard to focus, but I forced myself to stay calm, at least for now. I got out of my car, my heart pounding in my chest as I approached them. They didn't notice me at first. They were too wrapped up in each other. But when Monica finally saw me, her eyes went wide and she froze. Matt turned around, his face draining of color when he saw me standing there. "Chris." Monica's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes flicking nervously between me and Matt. I stood there, staring at them, the anger bubbling up inside me like a volcano about to erupt. But I didn't say anything at first. I wanted them to sweat. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done before I tore their lives apart. Matt took a step back, clearly uncomfortable. "Chris, man, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. "Really? Because it looks exactly like what it is. You're screwing my wife." Monica's face flushed, and she reached out toward me, her voice trembling. "Chris, please, I can explain." "Don't," I snapped, my voice cold and sharp. "Don't even try to explain. I know everything, Monica. I know about the lunches, the hotels, all the times you lied to my face about where you were. I've been tracking you for weeks." Her eyes widened in shock. "Tracking me?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the app, the GPS tracker flashing on the screen. "Yeah, tracking you. Every single time you met up with him. Every single lie you told me." Monica's face paled, and she took a step back, as if the physical distance would somehow protect her from the truth. "Chris, I don't want to hear it," I growled, cutting her off. "You think you can stand here and act like this was some innocent mistake? You think you can play the victim now that you've been caught?" She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she looked at me with those big, sad eyes that once used to make me melt. But now, they just made me sick. Matt stood there, speechless, his face pale, his hands shaking. He wasn't used to being the bad guy. He wasn't used to being called out for the piece of shit that he was. I turned to him, my blood boiling. "And you, my best friend? Really, Matt? You couldn't find someone else? You had to go after my wife?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like he wanted to say something, to defend himself, but what could he say? There was no excuse for what he had done. Nothing that would make this better. I took a step closer to him, my fists clenched at my sides. For a moment, I considered hitting him, considered knocking him out right there in the parking lot. But I stopped myself. He wasn't worth it. "You're dead to me," I said, my voice low and cold. "Both of you." Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. I didn't care what they did next. I didn't care if they went back inside the hotel or if they drove off together. It was over. Everything was over. When I got home, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. I sat on the couch, staring at the walls, trying to process what had just happened. The confrontation hadn't brought me any peace. It hadn't given me the closure I thought I needed. All I felt was a deep, hollow emptiness inside. I had loved Monica. I had trusted her. I had built my life around her. And she had destroyed it all in a matter of months. And Matt, my best friend, the man who was supposed to be like a brother to me, had been complicit in it the whole time. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever could have imagined. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the deception, the way they had both looked me in the eye and pretended like everything was fine. I had been played for a fool, and now I was left picking up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. I sat on that couch for hours, replaying every moment of the confrontation in my head. I thought confronting them would make me feel better, that it would give me some kind of release or closure. But the truth was, It had left me more broken than I ever imagined. I felt hollow inside, like a part of me had been ripped out and discarded. The house was eerily silent, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in my mind. Monica hadn't come home yet, and part of me wondered if she ever would. After everything that had just happened, would she even bother? And if she did come back, what would I say? Could I even stand to look at her again? I didn't know how to move forward. The life I had built, the trust one had given so freely, it was all gone. All I had left was a pile of lies and the bitter sting of betrayal. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over the call button. I wanted to call someone, anyone, to make sense of the mess I was in. But who was left? Matt was gone. He had been my go-to, the one I would call when things went wrong. But now, he was the reason everything had gone wrong. My best friend gone, just like that. I thought about calling Mike, a coworker who I hung out with from time to time, but we weren't that close. And I wasn't ready to spill this whole disaster to someone who didn't really know me. So, I just sat there, alone, letting the darkness of the room swallow me. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, my neck stiff from the awkward angle I'd slept in. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I rubbed my eyes, groggy and disoriented. It was a text from Monica. Monica, we need to talk. The audacity of it made my blood boil. After everything she had done, after all the lies and deceit, now she wanted to talk? I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell her to go to hell. But another part of me, the part that had loved her for 8 years, still felt the need for answers. I needed to hear her say it, to confess the full extent of what she had done. Me, come by later. But don't expect forgiveness. Her response was immediate. Monica, I'm so sorry, Chris. I'll be there after work. Sorry. That word felt so small compared to the weight of what she had done. She had shattered our life together, and all she could offer was a pathetic sorry. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She showed up around 6 p.m., her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from what I assumed had been hours of crying. But I wasn't moved by her tears. I wasn't here for her guilt. I wanted the truth, and I wasn't going to let her dance around it. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared so many meals, so many laughs, so many moments of our life together. But now, the air between us was thick with tension, with unspoken accusations. Monica sat across from me, wringing her hands nervously, avoiding eye contact. So, I said, breaking the silence, start talking. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She was clearly struggling, trying to find the right way to explain away her betrayal, but there was no right way. Not for this. I'm sorry, Chris, she whispered finally, her voice shaking. I never meant for this to happen. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. That's bullshit, and you know it. You don't accidentally sleep with someone else, especially not with my best friend. So, tell me, Monica, how long has this been going on? She looked down at the table, biting her lip as fresh tears welled up in her eyes. 6 months, she admitted quietly. 6 months. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. For half a year, she had been carrying on this affair with Matt behind my back, all the while pretending that nothing was wrong, that we were still a happy couple. I had been living a lie. How? I asked, my voice low and cold. How could you do this to me? To us? I don't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. It just happened. Matt and I started talking more, and then one night after work, we had a few drinks, and one thing led to another. One thing led to another? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. That's your excuse? You were bored, so you decided to screw my best friend? Her tears were flowing freely now, but they didn't move me. It wasn't like that, she sobbed. I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, I said, my voice hard. You hurt me, Monica. You hurt me more than I ever thought possible. She was shaking now, her sobs racking her body. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I thought I could stop it before it got worse. But what? I snapped. You didn't want to stop? She didn't answer. and that silence spoke louder than any words she could have said. She hadn't wanted to stop. She had wanted Matt, and she had chosen him over me, over our marriage, over everything we had built together. I loved you, I said quietly, my voice breaking. I trusted you, Monica, and you threw it all away. I know, she whispered, her face buried in her hands. I know I did. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. I didn't know what to say anymore. What was left to say? The woman I loved had betrayed me, and there was no fixing that. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies would make it go away. Finally, I stood up, pushing my chair back. I want a divorce. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. No, Chris, please. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can. No, I said firmly. It's over, Monica. You made your choice. But the kids, she cried. Think about the kids. We don't have kids, I reminded her coldly. Or did you forget that too? Her face crumpled, and she let out a choked sob. Chris, please. I'm done, I said, my voice final. I'll contact a lawyer tomorrow. You can stay here tonight, but I want you out by the end of the week. She collapsed into her chair, her sobs filling the kitchen, but I didn't stay to watch. I walked out of the room, out of the house, needing to get as far away from her as possible. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by a stranger who had lied to me for months, who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. As I drove away, the weight of it all settled over me, pressing down on my chest. The anger was still there, burning beneath the surface, but now it was mixed with something else, grief. Grief for the life I had lost, for the future that had been stolen from me. I didn't know how to move forward from here, but one thing was clear. This was the end. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and painful conversations. I hired a lawyer, filed for divorce, and made arrangements to move out of the house. Monica had tried to talk to me a few more times, begging me to reconsider, but I shut her down every time. There was nothing left to discuss. I couldn't forgive her. I couldn't forget what she had done, and I couldn't stay married to someone who had destroyed everything we had built together. Matt, for his part, had the decency to disappear. I hadn't heard from him since the confrontation at the hotel, and I didn't expect to. He knew what he had done, and he knew there was no coming back from it. He was out of my life, just like Monica, and good riddance. As the weeks passed, the pain began to dull, replaced by a numbness that I couldn't shake. I went through the motions, work, moving into a new apartment, trying to rebuild my life. But it all felt hollow, like I was living someone else's life, a life that didn't fit anymore. I had lost everything, my wife, my best friend, my sense of security, and now, all I had left was the empty shell of a life I no longer recognized. The numbness didn't go away. It stayed with me, lingering like a fog I couldn't shake. Every morning, I'd wake up in my new apartment, an empty place that didn't feel like home, and try to convince myself that things would get better, that I'd heal. But each day was a reminder of everything I'd lost. The life I once had, the dreams of a future with Monica, even the simple comfort of routine, gone, just like that, replaced by a cold silence that echoed in every corner of my mind. I tried to focus on work, burying myself in projects to keep the pain at bay. But even that didn't help. Everywhere I went, I saw reminders of the life I had built and lost. Colleagues asked how I was doing, offering awkward condolences when I told them about the divorce. Some knew about Monica's affair, others didn't, but none of it mattered. Their sympathy felt like a cruel joke. They didn't understand. How could they? I saw couples everywhere I looked, walking hand in hand, laughing, sharing moments of intimacy that once came so naturally to me and Monica. It felt like the universe was mocking me, rubbing salt into the wound every time I stepped outside. My mind kept returning to those nights I spent waiting for her to come home, to the dinners where I'd sit alone, telling myself she was working late, that nothing was wrong. The lies I told myself were just as deep as the ones she told me. And then there was Matt. The betrayal from him cut even deeper. For years, he had been more than just a friend. He was family. He had been with me through some of the hardest times in my life. We'd been through so much together, and now, he was nothing more than a memory, tainted by his selfishness. The fact that he hadn't even tried to reach out, hadn't made any effort to explain or apologize, only twisted the knife further. The worst part was that I couldn't escape the anger. It followed me everywhere, boiling just under the surface. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, fists clenched, replaying the moment I saw them together outside that motel. I'd imagine what I could have done differently, what I should have said, should have done, but it was all pointless. The damage was done. It wasn't until a few months later, when the divorce papers were finalized, that the reality of my situation finally hit me. Monica and I were no longer married. The life we had built together was legally over, and all that remained were the remnants of broken trust and shattered dreams. I sat in the lawyer's office, staring at the papers in front of me, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The lawyer was talking, explaining the final terms of the divorce, but I barely heard him. When I left the office, a fresh wave of grief hit me. I hadn't expected it to feel this real. Sure, I knew the divorce was coming, it was inevitable, but seeing it in black and white, seeing my marriage officially reduced to a stack of legal documents, made it feel final in a way that words couldn't. I sat in my car for a long time after that, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been so focused on the anger, on the betrayal, that I hadn't let myself truly feel the loss. But now, there was no denying it. It was over. There was no going back, no second chances, no hope for reconciliation. I had lost the woman I loved, the future we had planned, and the life I had envisioned for myself. For weeks after the divorce was finalized, I shut myself off from the world. I stopped going out, stopped answering calls from friends. I told myself I needed space, but in reality, I didn't know how to face anyone. I didn't know how to explain what had happened without feeling like a failure. It wasn't just the end of my marriage that hurt. It was the way it ended. The lies, the betrayal, the fact that I had been so blind to it all. People kept telling me that things would get better, that time would heal the wounds, and eventually, I'd move on. But time felt like the enemy. Every day that passed felt like another reminder of how much I'd lost. The world moved forward, but I was stuck, unable to let go of the anger, the pain, the sense of betrayal that consumed me. It wasn't until one night, after weeks of isolation, that I finally hit rock bottom. I was sitting in my apartment, the TV on in the background, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table. I had been drinking more than usual, not enough to get blackout drunk, but just enough to numb the edges of my emotions. The anger, the pain, it was all still there, but the alcohol made it easier to ignore. I don't remember what triggered it, but suddenly, I felt this overwhelming sense of rage. I grabbed my phone and opened the old GPS app, the one I had used to track Monica's car. It was still installed, though I hadn't used it since the day I confronted her and Matt. I stared at the app for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest as memories of that day flooded back. The lies, the motel, their laughter. I wanted to destroy something. I wanted to scream. I wanted to hurt them the way they had hurt me. Without thinking, I dialed Monica's number. My hands were shaking as the phone rang. I didn't even know what I was going to say, but I needed something. I needed to hear her voice, to remind myself that she had caused this, that she was the one who had destroyed our life together. She didn't answer. Part of me was relieved. I threw the phone onto the couch, letting out a shaky breath. I was losing control, spiraling deeper into the darkness that had been growing inside me since the day I caught them. I didn't know how to stop it, didn't know how to climb out of the pit I had fallen into. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a gnawing sense of guilt. I looked at my phone, seeing the missed call to Monica, and felt sick to my stomach. What was I doing? This wasn't who I was. I wasn't the kind of guy who called his ex-wife in the middle of the night, desperate for answers that would never come. I wasn't the kind of guy who let himself fall apart over someone who had proven they didn't care about him anymore. Something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the past, consumed by anger and regret. If I didn't find a way to let go, to move forward, I'd end up losing myself entirely. I started therapy a week later. At first, it felt strange. Sitting in a room with a stranger, pouring out all the pain and anger I had kept bottled up for months. I wasn't sure it would help, but I was out of options. I couldn't keep drowning in my own misery, and I couldn't keep pretending that I was okay. I wasn't. I was broken, and I needed help. The therapist, Dr. Nolan, was patient. She didn't push me to talk right away, didn't force me to confront everything at once. Instead, she let me open up at my own pace, unraveling the knots of pain and betrayal one thread at a time. I talked about Monica, about Matt, about the life I had lost. I talked about the anger, the sleepless nights, the constant sense of failure that haunted me. Grief isn't linear, Dr. Nolan told me during one of our sessions. It's messy, and it comes in waves. You're allowed to feel angry. You're allowed to feel sad. But you also have to give yourself permission to heal. It wasn't easy. I had spent so long holding on to the anger, letting it fuel me, that I didn't know how to let it go. But slowly, through therapy, I began to understand that holding on to the pain wasn't helping me. It wasn't bringing me closure or making the betrayal hurt any less. It was just keeping me stuck, trapped in the worst moments of my life. Therapy wasn't a quick fix. Nothing about this was. Each session with Dr. Nolan chipped away at the walls I had built up, but it was a slow process, like trying to move a mountain one handful of dirt at a time. I had spent months spiraling into a pit of anger, betrayal, and self-pity, and it wasn't something I could just undo in a few weeks. But it was something. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt like I was making some kind of progress. One of the hardest things to face was how much of my identity had been tied to Monica. Our marriage wasn't just a relationship, it had been my life. Every plan I'd made for the future, every decision, every moment, had involved her in some way. So when she betrayed me, it felt like I lost more than just a wife. I lost myself. In therapy, I talked about that a lot. About how I had to figure out who I was without her. About how, deep down, I was afraid that I wasn't enough on my own. That maybe, without her, I was just a shell of a person, incomplete. It was a hard realization, but Dr. Nolan helped me work through it. She helped me see that I wasn't defined by my marriage, that I was more than just the husband, that I had value, even if Monica had made me feel like I didn't. I also talked a lot about Matt. The betrayal from him, in some ways, cut even deeper than Monica's. Because with Matt, it wasn't just about the affair. It was about trust. He had been my best friend, my brother in everything but blood. We'd been through thick and thin together. And the idea that he could betray me like that, so casually, so easily, it broke something inside me that I didn't know how to fix. How do I forgive someone who doesn't even seem to care? I asked Dr. Nolan one day. He hasn't reached out. He hasn't apologized. He just disappeared. Forgiveness isn't about the other person, she said. It's about freeing yourself. You can't control what Matt does, or whether he apologizes. But you can control how much power you let him have over your life. Holding on to the anger doesn't punish him. It punishes you. It was a hard pill to swallow. For months, I had clung to the anger because it was easier than dealing with the grief. Anger was simple. It gave me something to focus on, something to push against. But as Dr. Nolan reminded me again and again, it wasn't helping me. If anything, it was keeping me stuck. As the weeks turned into months, I started to rebuild, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like I was slipping backward. There were still moments when the pain would hit me out of nowhere. A song on the radio, a couple laughing in a restaurant, a memory triggered by something small and insignificant. But I wasn't drowning in it anymore. I was learning how to swim. One day, while sorting through the last few boxes from the house, I came across a photo album that Monica and I had put together during our first year of marriage. I hadn't seen it in months, hadn't wanted to look at it. But now, as I flipped through the pages, I felt something different. It wasn't the sharp sting of betrayal that I had felt before. It was more like a dull ache, a recognition of what had been lost, but also of what had once been good. The photos were full of smiles, of happy memories, of moments when we were still in love, before everything fell apart. We had been good once. We had been happy. And while that didn't erase what had happened, it made me realize something important. Not everything was a lie. What we had shared wasn't all bad. and I didn't need to rewrite history just because it had ended so badly. I had loved her, and for a time, I believed she had loved me too. But people change, circumstances change, and sometimes things fall apart in ways that you can't control. It didn't make the betrayal any less painful, but it made it easier to accept that life moves on, even after the worst of it. One afternoon, months after the divorce had been finalized, I got an unexpected call from Monica. I hadn't spoken to her since we signed the papers, and I hadn't planned on hearing from her again, at least not anytime soon. So when her name popped up on my phone, my first instinct was to ignore it. But something made me answer. "Hey," I said, my voice wary. "Chris," she said, her voice soft. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize. Again. For everything. I didn't say anything at first. Her apology felt like too little, too late. But at the same time, I realized that I didn't feel the anger I used to. It was still there, somewhere deep down, but it wasn't overwhelming anymore. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she continued, "about us, about what I did. And I know I can't take it back, but I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry for how I hurt you, for how I lied. You didn't deserve that." I let out a long breath. "I know you're sorry, Monica, but that doesn't change anything." "I know," she said quickly. "I don't expect it to. I've been in therapy, and part of that is taking responsibility for the people I hurt. And I hurt you more than anyone." I didn't know how to respond to that. The part of me that had been wounded so deeply still wanted to scream at her, still wanted to ask why, to demand answers. But the other part of me, the part that had spent months in therapy, working to heal, felt a strange sense of closure. She was taking responsibility, and while it didn't erase the pain, it felt like a small step toward moving on. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally, "but I need to keep moving forward. I can't keep looking back." There was a long pause on her end. "I understand. I just wanted to say my piece." After that, we said our goodbyes, and I hung up the phone feeling a mix of emotions. It wasn't the closure I had expected, but it was something. And as I sat there, reflecting on the conversation, I realized that maybe I didn't need closure from her at all. Maybe the closure I needed had to come from within. The next few months were a blur of small victories. I started going out more, reconnecting with friends, and building a life that didn't revolve around Monica or Matt. I wasn't fully healed, but I was healing. I found joy in little things: weekend hikes, quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, evenings spent with people who cared about me. One night, I ran into an old friend at a bar. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we picked up right where we left off, laughing, catching up, and reminiscing about the old days. It was the first time in a long time that I felt genuinely happy. The weight of the past didn't feel so heavy anymore. "I heard about the divorce," she said, her voice gentle, as we sat at the bar. "I'm really sorry you went through that." "Thanks," I said, nodding. "It's been rough, but I think I'm getting through it." We talked for hours after that, and as the night went on, I realized something important. I wasn't broken anymore. I had been, for a long time. But now I was starting to put the pieces back together. I wasn't the same person I had been before the betrayal, but maybe that was okay. Maybe I didn't need to be. Time passed, and the memories of Monica and Matt began to fade. They were still there, but they no longer defined me. I no longer carried the weight of their betrayal like a badge of shame. Instead, I carried the lessons I had learned, the strength I had found in myself, the resilience I didn't know I had. There were still hard days, moments when the past would creep up on me when I least expected it. But those moments were fewer and farther between. I had learned how to cope, how to move forward, how to build a life that was mine. And in the end, that was enough. Months turned into seasons, and slowly, life began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't always easy, but it was no longer defined by the chaos and heartbreak that had consumed me after the affair. Instead, it was filled with moments of clarity, those quiet realizations that come when you've endured something soul-crushing and managed to survive. I started to feel lighter, as if I'd shed an invisible weight. The anger and betrayal that had once clung to me began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism that maybe, just maybe, I could build something new. It wasn't that I had forgotten what had happened. How could I? But I wasn't letting it define me anymore. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, looking through some old boxes I'd finally brought over from storage. It was full of mementos from my life before Monica, photos from college, souvenirs from trips I'd taken long before we'd even met. As I sifted through them, I realized how much of myself I had forgotten during those years of marriage. It wasn't that Monica had taken anything from me, at least not intentionally, but I had given up pieces of myself to fit into the mold of what I thought our life should be. I'd stopped doing the things that brought me joy, focusing instead on what I thought would make us happy. Looking back now, I saw how dangerous that had been. I had lost my sense of self along the way, and it had taken a major betrayal to make me realize how much I needed to reclaim. I came across an old journal I'd kept during my early 20s, back when I used to write every day. I flipped through the pages, reading the thoughts and dreams of a younger version of myself, a version that was full of ambition, curiosity, and hope. I barely recognized him, but I felt a flicker of connection. That night, I found myself pulling out an old notebook and jotting down a few lines. At first, the words felt clumsy, awkward, like I didn't know how to start again. But as the pen moved across the paper, I felt something stir inside me, a sense of purpose, of ownership over my own narrative. It wasn't about Monica or Matt or the pain they had caused. It was about me, about who I was and who I could become. I kept going to therapy, but the sessions became less about processing the past and more about looking toward the future. Dr. Nolan had been instrumental in helping me navigate the darkest moments, but now we were focusing on what came next. What did I want my life to look like? What did I want for myself, now that I wasn't weighed down by the expectations of a marriage that no longer existed? You get to write your own story now, Dr. Nolan said during one session. It's scary, but it's also liberating. You're no longer bound by what was. You get to decide what comes next. I thought about that a lot. For so long, I had been reacting to life, to Monica's betrayal, to the divorce, to the heartbreak. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I had the chance to be proactive, to make decisions for myself, not out of fear or pain, but out of a genuine desire to move forward. It was freeing, but it was also daunting. I wasn't sure what the future held, and that uncertainty was both exciting and terrifying. But as Dr. Nolan had reminded me, I didn't have to figure it all out at once. Life wasn't a race. It was a process, and I was finally starting to embrace that. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years because I had been so wrapped up in my life with Monica. Some of them knew about the divorce, while others were surprised when I mentioned it. But the conversations didn't revolve around the past. Instead, they were about the present, what I was doing now, how I was rebuilding. I also threw myself into hobbies I had abandoned long ago. I started hiking again, rediscovering my love for the outdoors. There was something about being in nature, away from the noise and chaos of daily life, that helped me clear my head. It reminded me that there was a world beyond the walls I had built for myself. I also picked up photography, something I had always been interested in but never had time for. I started taking my camera with me on hikes, capturing moments of beauty in the quiet stillness of the forest or the vibrant colors of a sunset. It became a form of therapy in its own right, a way to see the world differently, to focus on the present rather than the pain of the past. About a year after the divorce was finalized, something unexpected happened. I was at a coffee shop downtown, working on a project for work, when a familiar face walked in. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then she looked over, and our eyes met. It was Jenny. Jenny and I had dated briefly in college. Nothing serious, but we'd had a good time together. She had always been full of energy, always laughing, always the life of the party. We had lost touch after graduation, going our separate ways, but now, here she was, standing in front of me, smiling like no time had passed. "Chris," she said, walking over to my table. "Is that you?" I smiled, genuinely surprised. "Jenny, wow. It's been a while." She laughed, shaking her head. "No kidding. What are you doing here?" We ended up sitting together, catching up over coffee. It was easy, natural, even. There was no awkwardness, no sense of trying to force a conversation. It felt like slipping into an old, comfortable routine, but with the added depth that comes from years of experience and growth. Jenny had been through her own ups and downs since we last saw each other. She had moved around a lot, traveled the world, and eventually settled back in town to start her own photography business. We talked for hours, swapping stories and reminiscing about the old days, but also sharing the lessons we had learned along the way. I told her about the divorce, about everything that had happened with Monica and Matt. I didn't go into too much detail. I didn't want to rehash the pain, but Jenny listened with empathy, nodding as I spoke. She didn't pity me, though. She treated it like a fact of life, something I had gone through and survived. And that's exactly what I needed. At the end of the afternoon, she handed me her business card. "I'm doing a photography workshop next weekend," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "You should come. It'd be fun." I hesitated for a moment. "I'm not exactly a professional photographer." She laughed. "Neither was I when I started. That's what makes it fun." There was something about the way she said it, something about her energy, that made me want to say yes. Maybe it was because I had spent so much time rebuilding myself, or maybe it was because I was finally ready to take a chance on something new. So, I did. I said yes. The workshop turned out to be exactly what I needed. It wasn't just about learning new photography techniques. It was about rediscovering the joy of creating, of trying something new without the fear of failure. Jenny was a great teacher, but more than that, she was a reminder of the person I used to be before everything had gone wrong. She brought out a side of me that I hadn't seen in years, the side that was curious, adventurous, willing to take risks. We started spending more time together after that. At first, it was just casual, coffee here, a hike there, talking about photography or work. But as the months passed, something deeper began to develop between us. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't complicated. It was simple, easy, the way things should be. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward, not just away from the past, but towards something new, something better. As my relationship with Jenny grew, I began to realize just how far I had come. The Chris who had been betrayed by his wife, who had been consumed by anger and heartbreak, was still there, somewhere deep inside. But he wasn't in control anymore. I wasn't defined by what had happened to me. I was defined by what I had chosen to do with my life after the storm. There were still hard days. Days when the memories of Monica and Matt would creep back in, uninvited. But those days were rare now, and they didn't hold the same power over me that they once did. I had learned how to acknowledge the pain without letting it consume me. One evening, Jenny and I were sitting on the porch of her apartment, watching the sunset. She was flipping through the photos we had taken that day, laughing at some of the outtakes, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way I had come to love. She turned to me, her smile softening. "You seem happy, Chris." I thought about that for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was right. I was happy. It had taken time, so much time, but I had found my way back to myself. I had rebuilt my life, piece by piece, not by erasing the past, but by learning from it, by choosing to live again. I said, smiling back at her. "I really am." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Though life had started to look brighter, and happiness was no longer something I had to chase, there was one more hurdle I hadn't yet crossed: facing Matt. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I confronted him and Monica at the hotel. After everything, he had faded into the background of my life, a ghost of a friendship that had been shattered beyond repair. I had always figured he would just disappear forever, and for a while, I was fine with that. But now that time had passed, something gnawed at me. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't that I wanted to make peace with what he had done. But there was an itch, a lingering thread I hadn't tied off. Matt had been a huge part of my life for so long, and now that I was beginning to feel like myself again, I knew I needed closure on that front, too. I needed to see him one last time, to face him and finally close that chapter for good. It was Jenny who encouraged me to reach out. "You don't need to forgive him," she said, her hand resting on mine as we sat in the same coffee shop where we had reconnected. "But if you feel like there's something unresolved, maybe it's time to confront that. For your own peace of mind." She was right. I had made so much progress, learned how to let go of the bitterness that once consumed me. But there was still a part of me that couldn't fully move on without addressing the elephant in the room. Matt was a part of my story, for better or worse, and ignoring that wouldn't make the hurt go away. If I was going to fully heal, I had to confront him one last time. I found out through mutual friends that Matt had moved out of town a few months after the affair had come to light. It wasn't surprising. Our small town had its way of magnifying scandals, and his betrayal wasn't exactly a secret. He had left behind a trail of broken relationships, not just with me, but with other friends who couldn't look at him the same way after what he'd done. No one knew where he had gone, exactly, but I had a good idea of how to find him. I reached out to his younger brother, Tim. We weren't close, but we'd always gotten along well enough. When I called, Tim seemed surprised to hear from me, but he told me Matt was living a few hours away, working a dead-end job at some car dealership in the middle of nowhere. Tim gave me the address without asking too many questions, and I could tell he knew why I was calling. He didn't press. I appreciated that. A week later, I was on the road, driving out to see Matt for the first time in over a year. When I pulled up to the address Tim had given me, I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe part of me thought Matt would be doing fine, that he would have moved on, just like I was trying to do. But when I saw the run-down apartment complex he was living in, the reality of his situation hit me. I parked the car and stared at the building for a while, wondering if I was making a mistake. Did I really need this? Was it worth dredging up all the old pain just to say goodbye to someone who didn't deserve any more of my time? But something inside me pushed forward. I knocked on his door and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. A part of me didn't want him to answer. But a few moments later, the door creaked open, and there he was. Matt. He looked rough, worse than I expected. His once athletic build had softened, his face was gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't look like the man who had once been my best friend. He looked lost. "Chris," he said, his voice thick with surprise. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." I stood there for a moment, trying to reconcile the image of the man in front of me with the memories I had of the person he used to be. It was like looking at a stranger. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I knew that wouldn't give me what I came for. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady. Matt stepped aside, letting me in. The apartment was small, cluttered, and smelled faintly of cigarettes. It was a far cry from the life he used to have. We sat down at his small kitchen table, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything that had been left unsaid for too long. Finally, Matt spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I know that doesn't mean much now, but I've been carrying that guilt every day since it happened. I ruined everything." I looked at him, studying his face. The remorse in his eyes was real, but it didn't soften the impact of what he'd done. "You didn't just ruin our friendship, Matt," I said, my voice low. "You destroyed my marriage. You lied to me, to my face, for months." "I know," he whispered, his hands shaking as he rubbed his temples. "I don't know what the hell I was thinking. I wasn't thinking. I was selfish, and I was an idiot. I hate myself for it." I let his words sink in, but I didn't feel any satisfaction. His regret didn't change anything. It didn't erase the pain or the betrayal, but it was something. At least he knew he had destroyed something good. "I came here because I need closure," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "I don't forgive you, Matt. I probably never will. But I need to move on with my life, and I can't do that if I'm still holding on to this." He nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. "I understand. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it." We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The anger that had once consumed me had faded, replaced by a strange sense of finality. There was no redemption for Matt, no way for him to make up for what he had done. But seeing him now, broken and full of regret, I realized that I didn't need anything from him anymore. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to walk away. "I'm done with this," I said quietly as I stood up to leave. "Take care of yourself, Matt." He didn't try to stop me. He didn't beg for forgiveness or ask for another chance. He just nodded, his eyes downcast, as I walked out the door. The drive home was quiet. I expected to feel some kind of release, but what I felt was more subtle, a sense of closure that had been missing for so long. Seeing Matt like that, so far removed from the person he used to be, reminded me that I had made the right decision in moving on. His life was in shambles and mine, though not perfect, was finally starting to come together again. When I got home, Ginny was waiting for me. I hadn't told her much about Matt, but she knew enough to understand what this meeting meant. She wrapped her arms around me as I walked in, pulling me into a tight hug. "How'd it go?" "It's over," I said simply. "I got what I needed." She nodded, holding me close, and in that moment, I realized just how far I had come. Matt's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything, but now, it was just another part of my past. A painful part, sure, but one that no longer had the power to control me. Life continued to move forward, and so did I. Jenny and I grew closer, building something solid, something real. It wasn't perfect, no relationship ever is, but it was honest. It was built on trust, on mutual respect, and on the lessons I had learned from my past. I wasn't the same person I had been before the betrayal, but in many ways, I was stronger for it. I had survived something that had once seemed insurmountable, and now I was living again. There were still moments when the memories of Monica and Matt would surface, but they no longer held the same weight. They were just that, memories. They were a part of my story, but they didn't define my future. I had reclaimed my life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was mine. As I sat with Ginny one evening, watching the sunset from our porch, I realized something important. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And though I had been through hell, I had come out on the other side stronger, more resilient, and ready to embrace whatever came next. For the first time in years, I was at peace. As the days turned into weeks, I started to realize how much my life had changed, how much I had changed. It wasn't just about moving on from Monica and Matt. It wasn't even about rebuilding what had been lost. It was about becoming someone new, someone stronger, more self-aware, more in control of their own destiny. I hadn't noticed the changes happening at first. They had come gradually, almost imperceptibly, as I took small steps forward each day. But now, looking back at everything I had been through, I could see it clearly. The man I was before the affair, before the divorce, before the pain, that man was gone. And in his place was someone better, someone who had survived the worst life had to offer and come out the other side with a clearer sense of who he was and what he wanted. I started saying yes to things I would have once shied away from. I signed up for new photography classes, pushed myself to try things that scared me, hiking more difficult trails, taking on new projects at work, even starting to think about writing again. It was like a spark had been reignited inside me, a spark that had been dulled for so long by the weight of betrayal and heartache. And through it all, Jenny was there, quietly supporting me, cheering me on without ever making me feel like I needed to rush the healing process. We were taking things slow, building something real, and that was all I needed. There was no pressure, no sense of urgency, just two people figuring out life together, one day at a time. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Jenny and I were sitting on the couch, flipping through old photos from a trip we'd taken a few weeks earlier. It was a small weekend getaway to the mountains, nothing extravagant, but it had been exactly what we needed. As we laughed at some of the pictures, especially the ones where I had tried to take artsy shots that turned out hilariously wrong, Jenny suddenly looked at me with a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "You're different, you know that?" she said, smiling gently. "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Stronger," she said. "More yourself. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like you've finally come into your own. Like you're not holding on to anything anymore." Her words caught me off guard, but as I sat there, thinking about it, I realized she was right. I had changed. I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I wasn't defined by what Monica and Matt had done to me. I had let go of the anger, the betrayal, the need for closure that had consumed me for so long. I had found peace. "You're right," I said softly, pulling her closer. "I feel it too. For the first time in a long time, I feel free." Jenny rested her head on my shoulder, her fingers lacing with mine. We sat like that for a long time, the room filled with a comfortable silence, neither of us needing to say anything. The past was behind us, and the future, our future, was full of possibilities. And as I sat there, holding the hand of the woman who had helped me rediscover myself, I realized that the journey wasn't about finding the perfect ending. It wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending it never happened. It was about embracing the journey itself, with all its ups and downs, and finding strength in the process. The betrayal had changed me, but it hadn't destroyed me. If anything, it had made me stronger. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready, because I had survived. And now, I was truly living again. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.